everyone. Welcome back to the Imperfect Podcast. I'm your host, Kirsten Pfeiffer, and today I'm joined by Taylor Newendorp, who is a licensed clinical professional counselor and the founder and president of Chicago Counseling Center, which specializes in the treatment of OCD, perfectionism, and anxiety disorders. Taylor is also the author of the Perfectionism Workbook, Proven Strategies to Break Free from Perfectionism and Achieve Your Goals. So needless to say, having him on here today feels like a full circle moment, being that the name of this podcast is Imperfect, and perfectionism is something that I've kind of struggled with my whole life. And if you've listened to episode 29 with Jenna Overbach, they're actually colleagues at the No CD app, which is, I'll let Taylor kind of get more into what that app is, because I'm sure that you'll do a lot better job describing that than I will. But thank you, Taylor.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm very glad to be here. And I just love the name of your podcast, first and foremost.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much that I feel like we can go into with that. But why don't you start out by just telling me kind of a little bit more about yourself and what led you to this work of really focusing on perfectionism?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. So I've been practicing as a counselor, as a therapist for almost 17 years now. And I often say, when I first started out, I wished I had known about perfectionism and just how kind of insidious and widespread it is. I've struggled with some perfectionistic tendencies in the past, and I never really fully realized what it was until I was actually starting to treat other people and seeing them kind of describe the same tendencies and beliefs and behaviors that I had struggled with in the past, especially in my adolescence and kind of college age years in my early 20s. But, I worked in a variety of different settings. I started out working in a substance abuse treatment center for adolescents and their families. Then I worked for many, many years with eating disorders. And after that, kind of switched the focus to treating people with OCD and anxiety disorders. And that's really been my primary focus for about the last 12 or 13 years at this point. And with all those different populations, people struggling with substance abuse and addiction, people struggling with eating disorder behaviors, and definitely people struggling with OCD and anxiety and kind of chronic high levels of stress, I saw so many people describing this perceived need and desire to try and be perfect in everything they were doing, the way they were coming across to other people. And sometimes with OCD, we even hear people describing feeling like they have to be perfect in the way they're even thinking about things in their own mind. So this just kind of became a subspecialty of mine. And it's been really enjoyable, actually, to learn over the years that there are very specific treatment methods, specific skills people can learn if they're struggling with perfectionism itself, and it's perfectionism that is kind of unhealthy and cross the line where it's actually interfering with their lives instead of helping.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I know in the intro, I kind of mentioned No CD, but I would love, before we really dive into it, if you can just tell listeners a little bit more about what that is.
Yeah, so No CD did start as an app. It was originally designed to help people with OCD kind of better understand the nature of their condition. OCD is often misdiagnosed, even by mental health professionals. It's kind of overlooked in the health community in general, and it's not as well understood as it needs to be. And as a result, people with OCD often live with it for years, sometimes decades, before they even realize that is what they are living with. And that's what's causing them a lot of anxiety and distress, and likely impairing their ability to function as well. So No CD was originally developed as an app to kind of support people around the world with OCD, help them understand more about it. And then over the years, it's grown to the point where now we offer live telehealth sessions for people all over the United States, all over Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom. And we're gradually expanding to help people literally all over the world with OCD. So we provide direct clinical services to people with a diagnosis of OCD. And my position there has been amazing. I'm a clinical director, which means I get to oversee a lot of different therapists, help them learn about effective treatment for OCD and provide ongoing guidance and consultation and supervision. And it's just been really phenomenal. I've been there in a full-time capacity for the last few years. And in those few years, we went from having about 5 therapists to now we have over 300. And we went from helping a few dozen people with OCD to, I think most recently, we had over 7,000 people
Wow.
in our network that we were helping with OCD.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And before we get into kind of like the perfectionism stuff and how it does relate with OCD, just kind of going off of what you said about how so many people are misdiagnosed or OCD is misunderstood, can you kind of speak a little more to that and why you think there are so many misunderstandings surrounding OCD?
Yeah, definitely. I'm always happy to talk about this. So OCD itself is what we would call a neuropsychiatric disorder. It's essentially a brain disorder. And most people are born with kind of a genetic predisposition to develop it. And at some point in their life, usually when they encounter something stressful or they're going through a major life transition, maybe they've suffered a loss in their family, whatever it is, there's usually some significant event that causes the obsessive compulsive tendencies to really kind of come to the forefront, if you will. And then the nature of the disorder itself is categorized by obsessions and compulsions. Obsessions are any kind of intrusive, unwanted thought, image, or even an urge the person experiences. And usually for the person with OCD, the very nature of those thoughts and images is really upsetting. We often say they are quote unquote ego dystonic, which means the content, if you will, of the thoughts or images that go along with the obsessions kind of go against the person's morals and values and true beliefs. So the obsessions themselves cause a lot of anxiety and discomfort for the individual. They simply don't like having those kinds of intrusive images in their head. And over time, people develop compulsions. Compulsions can be really anything. It can be any sort of outward physical act. It can even be kind of a mental act or a mental process the person goes through to kind of, we often say neutralize the obsession. They're trying to get rid of the unwanted thoughts, trying to get rid of that discomfort and anxiety that's associated with it. And kind of the trap of OCD is that for a brief period of time, compulsions, quote unquote, work. Meaning someone goes through a compulsive process, whatever it may be, the obsession does fade away, the anxiety fades away, but it's always temporary. So no matter what, because of the nature of the disorder, the unwanted intrusive thoughts come back. The person has that corresponding anxiety, and they usually end up doing more and more compulsions, just trying to get some relief.
Yeah.
Over time, the compulsions themselves become really time consuming. That's usually what's causing impairment in functioning. And the compulsions themselves cause a lot more distress for people. So the problem here is that when people are starting to experience an onset of obsessions and compulsions, they don't fully understand it themselves. I've heard so many people over the years say, I just thought this is how people thought, right? I just thought a lot of people were kind of thinking the same way I was. Or on the flip side, people can recognize something is different, something is upsetting, but they're way too ashamed or embarrassed to tell anybody about it. So they don't open up about their symptoms.
Yeah.
The problem on top of all that is that when people end up trying to seek out help, it's usually hard for them to describe what's going on. And they might describe obsessions as worries or say, like, I just feel really stressed or I feel really anxious a lot of the time. And that's really quick to be misdiagnosed as kind of general anxiety or maybe general chronic stress the person is dealing with. Because the problem, quite frankly, is it's not just that people outside of the health profession don't know a lot about OCD. People within the health profession don't know enough about OCD. So it's just not recognized. And as a result, people, get these misdiagnoses. It could be general anxiety. They could just be told. I mean, I've worked with so many people like, well, my doctor just told me I worry a lot. And that's just kind of how I am, right? The problem there is they're not getting effective help for it. And there are a couple modes of treatment that are highly, highly effective for OCD, cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure and response prevention. So it's just unfortunate that people don't really have the education they need to understand what they're living with. And if they don't get the correct diagnosis, they're probably not getting the correct help for it either.
Well, that's really helpful context to kind of lay that all out. And I think even for myself, like I've shared this before on my podcast, like I was diagnosed with OCD when I was a kid. And thankfully it was earlier on, like I was in 5th grade and I was really angry at my parents for bringing me to a therapist because they saw that something was going on, and it was more so because of the perfectionism I was exhibiting. And like me being really hard on myself, especially when it came to like schoolwork and things like that. And so they saw it developing in these unhealthy patterns that was like beyond me just being a good student. And but I was so ashamed that like there, you know, especially like when you're younger, I think it's like, oh, there's something wrong with me. And like I think I live in Los Angeles now where like everyone has a therapist, but like when I was younger, like I didn't know anyone that had a therapist. It felt very stigmatized to me. And finally, when they did diagnose me with OCD, I rejected it because I was like, in my mind, OCD was, I think a lot of times in movies, it's portrayed very extremely and doing these really intense rituals. And for me, like my compulsions really didn't manifest and still don't manifest in any of those, like flipping the light switch like 20 times or whatever it's been portrayed as. It more so was the thought patterns. And I dealt with it by, you know, those kind of what you were explaining before of like how you deal with your thoughts and then how that manifests for me again in perfectionism. So I think that's just one example for anyone listening of like kind of how it's not just black and white and it's not one size fits all. And there is a lot of shame that kind of comes with it as well because of even the nature of perfectionism is, as Brene Brown puts it, she says it's a defense mechanism against shame. So with that, kind of getting into the perfectionism side of it, how would you define perfectionism? And I know in your book, you actually refer to it as an illusion. So I would love if you can kind of speak to all of that.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. And one thing I always think is important to make clear is that perfectionism is very, very common with OCD. And we can get more into that later on. But you don't have to have a diagnosis of OCD to have perfectionistic tendencies.
Right.
So I always point that out because sometimes I get weird looks or reactions when I tell people I treat perfectionism, because perfectionism itself it's not a diagnosis.
Yeah.
It's usually a set of personality traits that someone just kind of develops and exhibits over time. So I always say perfectionism is an illusion because perfection is an illusion. I always like to kind of go back just to the dictionary and look at what some of these words actually mean. So perfect, I'm not going to get this just right, which is fine, but perfect is usually defined as like the absence of flaws. So I always ask people, who do you know that's perfect, right? What human being exists without a single flaw? It's so right off the bat, that idea that humans could somehow be perfect seems impossible to me. It seems like an illusion, right? And then when we're talking about perfectionism, you know, when it's become kind of a clinical issue for someone, it's really causing a lot of distress and impairment in their day-to-day lives. Perfectionism itself is kind of this set of beliefs that anything short of perfect is unacceptable. So then I always like really challenge people to think about this. Okay, if perfect or perfection is existence without a single flaw, and then you've developed perfectionism where you're viewing anything short of perfection as unacceptable, then haven't you kind of formed this belief that everything is unacceptable?
Wow.
Because nothing's perfect, right? And I think perfectionism is also an illusion because it's subjective, right? So I could have an idea in my mind of what constitutes perfection, and I'm sure it'd be very different from yours or a million other people's ideas. So if perfection itself is subjective, how could anybody actually attain it?
That's so brilliant. And it's true. I mean, it's when you really unravel it and And I know like a lot of times I'm trying to make this not too specific of an episode about OCD, but that's just my frame of reference, obviously.
Mhm.
But, I think even with like ERP, exposure and response therapy, that's what it stands for, right?
Yeah, exposure and
Okay.
response
Yeah.
prevention. Yeah, you got
Yeah.
it.
But even with that, like the whole mindset behind that is like kind of exposing yourself to the things that you are. Well, you're the expert. I'll let you explain what that is.
Yeah, I'm always happy to talk about ERP too, because when I start to explain it, I'm sure some people listening will be like, that sounds awful. Why would you do that?
Right.
Because exposure and response prevention is a form of treatment that is designed for people to actually expose themselves to their fears.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So using kind of like an OCD example, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like I was saying, people get these unwanted obsessions. They're distressed by it. They engage in a compulsion to get that temporary relief. But over time, it's actually just making things worse.
Mm-hmm.
It's increasing their anxiety. It's actually increasing the likelihood that those unwanted obsessions are going to come back even more frequently and even more
Mm-hmm.
repetitively.
Mm-hmm.
So we really focus on, with ERP, exposing someone to some sort of trigger, anything that sets off an unwanted thought or image for them.
Mm-hmm.
And then the idea is we're really focusing then on the response prevention, which is having the person make an active effort to resist their compulsion, resist
Mm-hmm.
anything they're trying to do to immediately seek safety or seek a sense of relief in that moment. So people are often put off by this because part of exposure therapy is actually designed to purposely induce anxiety, but it's with reason. It is with a good cause, right? We're not
Yeah.
just trying to make people feel miserable
Yeah.
or upset or anything like that. The idea behind it, and this does work, is that people are experiencing an unwanted feeling of any kind. It could be guilt, shame, anxiety, the list goes on and on. And they're not immediately trying to get relief from it. And what they learn is that without a compulsion, without seeking safety or trying to get rid of an unwanted feeling, inevitably, even if that feeling gets a little bit more intense, it will hit a peak and then start to subside.
Mm-hmm.
So without doing anything about it, our emotions just come and go.
Yeah.
So the powerful learning that can occur with ERP, especially with OCD, is that people literally learn they can tolerate discomfort and they don't have to engage in their compulsions.
Mm-hmm.
And the less people are engaging in compulsions, and if they actually teach themselves to completely stop altogether, which people can do, what we also see as kind of like a nice side effect is that the frequency and the intensity of the obsessions starts to fade as well.
Yeah.
So another way to think of it is, let's say someone gets an intrusive thought. I'll use contamination because it's a very common form of OCD, but OCD exists in honestly countless manifestations. But let's say someone gets an intrusive thought, feeling, image, even just kind of like this sense that somehow they're contaminated. And they have a fear that they could then spread that contamination to others and it would cause harm to others. This is very, very common with OCD. That whole idea would produce a lot of distress. But as soon as the person gives in and compulsively washes their hands for 4 minutes or whatever it may be,
Mm-hmm.
as soon as they do that, they're treating that unwanted thought or image or idea as a threat. But it was never a threat to begin with. There's literally just a thought, right? So the problem is the more people are giving into compulsions and seeking safety from unwanted thoughts, they're treating thoughts as threats.
Mm.
With exposure and response prevention, when people can focus on something that feels uncomfortable and literally not do anything about it, the brain learns that the thought is not a threat.
Right.
And over time, there's less anxiety and less unwanted thoughts as a result.
And the reason why I even, brought that up I was thinking of that when you were explaining perfectionism. And I think this principle and kind of like philosophy behind it can apply whether you have OCD or not. It's like, what is the perfectionism coming from? Like, what's driving that? And how am I using like this perfectionistic like behavior to mask some kind of insecurity that I have? And so I think like whether it's, for me, a lot of times, like I just have to sit there and journal and be like, why am I striving to do this? And a lot of times it's because of like either an unwanted thought or some kind of insecurity that I'm having that I think that like me being perfect will make me feel better about myself, or like somehow, increase my inherent value. And I think whether you have OCD or not, like we're in a world full of like distractions and kind of avoiding what's really going on, and like go, 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 be work harder, like do better, and I think this like culture of busyness has lended itself to people feeling like they have to be perfect. Would you agree with that? Have you seen that in your work?
Oh, I would agree 100%. And I think, especially what's portrayed by people on social media
Mm,
has a huge influence on people, obviously, for better or for worse.
yeah.
But I think, what one thing there, and I totally agree. I mean, people are more distracted than ever.
Hmm.
And I can tell you honestly, like trying to distract yourself from discomfort ultimately doesn't help
Right.
either. Trying to avoid any kind of uncomfortable thoughts or feelings ultimately doesn't work. We often say avoidance actually increases anxiety and stress over time.
Right.
But I think, the problem is, think about like a post someone puts on Facebook or a picture on Instagram, whatever it may be. People are only putting like their best face out there, right?
Hmm.
Um, and they're probably, there are 1,000 different filters someone could use for a
Yeah.
picture, right? Or we never know, right? They could have taken
Totally.
18 or 50 different pictures or tried to take
Hmm.
the same video clip 100 times until in their mind it was perfect. And then
Right.
that's what's presented out there to the world. And other people do start to form this idea, oh, that's how I should be. That's what I
Mm.
should be putting out there as well. And just perfectionism in general, like, I mean, a lot of people want to know like where it comes from. We don't know, honestly. I'm
Right.
not going to sit here and try and make something up, but we do know there are things that just occur over the course of a person's life that can certainly kind of start to solidify
Hmm.
perfectionistic beliefs and perfectionistic thinking patterns. It could be things like, home environment we grew up in. I think there are people that have big influences on us over the course of our lives, like teachers, coaches, bosses, supervisors, mentors, who sometimes unwittingly, by pushing us to be better, do better, and kind of strive for the best, are kind of instilling this idea that what we already were wasn't enough. What we were
Right.
already doing wasn't enough. And to me, that's the trap of perfectionism. When people are really striving to come off a certain way, to be a certain way that in their mind would be perfect, it's
Mhm.
still never enough.
Right. Right.
But they try, right? No matter how hard they're working, no matter how they're trying to present themselves to other people, for someone stuck in like a perfectionistic belief system, it's never enough.
Right.
And that's where people really get stuck, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up an interesting point too of like, a lot of times where these thoughts of perfectionism or tendencies to strive for that come from maybe well-meaning people
Mm-hmm.
like pushing you. And, even for me in my journey, I think sometimes where it's been hard for me to let go of that is like I've seen the ways in which perfectionism has actually made me really successful in my life, and that's actually what my first therapist was in fifth grade said, like, this is makes you do really good work. Like OCD is not a bad thing if you learn how to channel it. Like it's makes you very successful, but you have to like learn how to keep it in its place. Otherwise, it can be detrimental. And so I have a two-part question for you. And the first part is, what advice would you have? Like if someone's struggling to let go. And again, I made this joke in before we started recording. This is not a therapy session. I need to like not go there, but I'm more so just as like general advice. Like, how can people still have that trait that makes them successful without like falling into perfectionism, if that makes sense. Because I think that that's a fear I've had, and I'm sure that other people out there might be kind of struggling with that balance.
Yeah, it's tough, and I probably have a lot of answers for you. So I'll try and edit myself here. But
Okay.
I think when I'm working with people with kind of perfectionistic tendencies, I talk about the goals they've set for themselves,
Mm.
right? And more often than not, you're going to hear people say things along the lines of, "Well, my goal is to be perfect. My goal is to get this assignment just right, right? Like I want the A plus 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 and all the bonus points. I want the perfect GPA, the perfect score. And it can be any job the person has. I want to make sure I'm doing everything just right every single day. But when I'm talking about these goals, I rarely hear people say things along the lines of, I want to do something that helps me feel fulfilled. I want to do something that feels meaningful to me. I want to do something that creates happiness and contentment.
Wow.
It's almost like this singular focus on trying to achieve something that, like we said at the outset, is essentially unachievable. I hope this answers your question a little bit, but what I often ask people as well is, okay, let's say we'll use a project at work as one example. Let's say you're working on it. Is that process, whatever project it is you're working on, is it driven by excitement, enjoyment, curiosity?
Mm-hmm.
If so, there's a good sign that you're like kind of striving for excellence.
Mm.
You're doing work that is meaningful and fulfilling to you in the process. So that's
Right.
great.
Right.
But on the flip side, if that process is driven by dread, anxiety, fear, and just feels incredibly stressful and upsetting,
Mm-hmm.
and still you get through, kind of cross the finish line, if you will, complete the task, whatever it may be, and you still have this idea that you should have done it better,
Mm-hmm.
could be better, and essentially you're left feeling dissatisfied, that's more of a sign of perfectionism.
It's a great distinction. And I think even, if for me, like having those perfectionistic tendencies, a lot of it is also what I also strive to do good work because I'm passionate about what I do. So that's something that has helped me in the process is like focusing on the why and focusing on like the internal reason versus like the external perception of me being perfect versus like I'm really passionate about what I'm doing. For example, this podcast. So like I'm going to do my best to make it the best it can be. But at the end of the day, like I'm just going to focus on making that impact and I'm not going to be hard on myself if it's not exactly how I wanted it to turn out to be. And so, even naming this podcast Imperfect was kind of an exercise in that. And I have had to remind myself so many times throughout that process that, perfectionism doesn't exist and like getting something done a lot of times is better than not doing it at all because it's not perfect. And I think sometimes in my journey, like it's taken me a while to do something because I've just been so obsessed about like, well, it's not good enough yet, so I'm not going to put it out there. And so that kind of gets into the second part of the question I had there with like, what are the dangers in perfectionism? And obviously like procrastination is one of them. But I know that you also talk about in your book, there's 5 tendencies of toxic perfectionism. Can you speak a little to that?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll start with the one you already mentioned, which is procrastination.
Right.
And I always like to talk about this one because, being honest, it's what I struggled with in the past, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe sometimes here and there to this day, it still gets to me. But I also like to talk about it because I think when people are thinking about perfectionism, that wouldn't be the first thing that comes into their mind.
Right.
Right. I think a lot of people, there's kind of this stereotype, kind of a stigma, if you will, as well with perfectionism, that someone who's striving for perfection and is a perfectionist themselves, like they're often labeled like type A personalities. These might be people who are perceived as workaholics, all that kind of stuff. And that certainly applies to a lot of people with perfectionism. They're like working themselves past the point of exhaustion all the time, kind of sacrificing their own personal needs for others because they want to, again, come off a certain way to other people all the time. So that's probably the more common idea or perception of what a perfectionist would look like. But then there's a whole host of us who are stuck in like procrastination and avoidance. And kind of like you alluded to, which I can personally relate to, in my academic career, so like through high school, college, even graduate school, I would have concerns and worries and fears that I would not get an assignment just right. And I also knew for myself, once I got into the process of doing it, it probably wasn't going to be too fun because of the unnecessary, undue pressure I was putting on myself to get it all perfect, to get it all just right.
Right.
And just knowing that the process itself was not going to be enjoyable for me, it was easier in my mind in the short term just to put it off. Right. What I learned later in life, and I've seen this in so many people I've worked with over the years since then, is that when you're procrastinating something or avoiding something, you're actually increasing your own anxiety and stress around it. Because think about it, if you're procrastinating something, it's not like you don't know it has to get done, right?
Right, right.
Right? It's still kind of lingering there in the back of your mind, which is just kind of unsettling in general. And then I know for myself, I often found myself trying to be productive in a bunch of different ways, but I was actually procrastinating. Right. So I always make a joke like I kind of recognize for myself when I had like a huge assignment due in college or grad school, that was the cleanest my apartment ever was. I was spending all my time. Oh, I haven't done laundry in a while. I'm going to do that now.
Yeah.
Clean up this corner of the room. Let me clean out all my old stuff. Let me go make some donations. Right.
Right.
Let me do anything else that's not directly related to this assignment I'm dreading because I'm afraid I'm not going to get it perfect. Right.
Right. Right.
Then also, what kind of occurs for people if they procrastinate something long enough, and then you're pulling an all nighter or whatever it is to get it done at the last second. If you then don't get that perfect result, it's really easy to fall back on, well, I ran out of time.
Right.
Right. So, and I know that occurred for me a lot of times. Like I wouldn't get the A. I'd still get like a B or a B plus, which in my mind wasn't good enough. But I also had this kind of built-in excuse. Well, I didn't have enough time. I didn't start until the night before. So I think a lot of people kind of stay stuck, almost kind of like paralyzed in that state of kind of distress for a while as they're actively putting things off because they're afraid of how the processes might go, and or they're afraid of not getting the result they would want.
Right. Yeah. And it's easier to be like, oh, well, I didn't get an A because like I didn't have enough time versus like I put 100% into this. I gave myself plenty of time and I didn't come up good enough or whatever the narrative is, because then I think that fuels that like perfectionism where like, identity is so wrapped up in that, and like kind of reaffirming those thoughts and those fears that, I'm not good enough or whatever it may be. So I definitely relate to that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know you'd asked about, I think I came up with five kind of toxic areas of perfectionism. There's definitely the procrastination and avoidance, people pleasing, and like an excessive need to, feel approved of by others. That's certainly one. Criticism is a big one. It's usually self-criticism. You mentioned briefly earlier, like sometimes like in the past, you might be hard on yourself, right? That's self-criticism, right? Sometimes with perfectionism, the criticism is also displayed towards others, unfortunately, because, the person has built up their own perfectionistic expectations in their own mind, not just of how they should be or what they should be doing, but how other people around them should also be. So you can have someone who's a perfectionist, being highly critical of others because they feel like they aren't doing things the right way, or they're not behaving the way they perceive as perfect or good enough.
Right.
Along with that, I think another one is just excessive fear of being judged by others. We see a lot of people with perfectionistic tendencies who also meet criteria for social anxiety disorder and social phobia, because they have this idea that whenever they're around other people, they have to present themselves perfectly. They have to say the right thing in the right way. They have to be well liked. It kind of crosses over with that need for approval from others as well.
Right.
And then I think, there's kind of this idea that mistakes are not allowed. So I often call that just, kind of a fear of failure. But with perfectionism, we can also see fear of success. Meaning if people, are working excessively hard and they do actually get a result they want, then there's added pressure to keep doing more of that as much as they can.
Right.
So all of that leads to a lot of things we see with perfectionism, just kind of general depression, general sense of dissatisfaction with day-to-day life. Like I was saying earlier, sometimes it gets bad enough that people are abusing substances as a way to just kind of numb out feelings or not think about all the things that are running through their head all the time. So it can have a damaging effect. I mean, I think the saddest cases are people who are having thoughts of or actually complete suicide because they're so upset because in their mind they haven't lived up to these completely unrealistic expectations.
Yeah. And it can be like a slippery slope, because thoughts are so powerful. And I think it's like there also is this spectrum I've experienced of like you constantly, like anything else, like have to continue to work at it. And some days you might be like stronger, and then other days you might kind of revert back to things. But I think having an idea of the different ways that it can be exhibited, like you just mentioned, actually has been really helpful for me for realizing maybe when I'm not in like a good, healthy place mentally, when I'm not even realizing I'm kind of on that slippery slope. So, for example, the biggest thing for me is and I tend to be pretty like gracious towards others and like try to be kind and optimistic. I realize that I have not necessarily taken care of myself mentally when I start to have negative thoughts about other people and like kind of criticize them in my mind or be really let down by people a lot. And then I'm like, wait a minute, why am I feeling this way? Oh, wait a minute. I look in the mirror, I'm being really hard on myself. And then you kind of unravel like, well, where is this coming from? What are the lies I'm believing? And so because it can look different for every different person, and then also like in different seasons, I think perfectionism can exhibit itself differently. I think just being aware of all of that so that you can kind of like, it's like a whack-a-mole game, like just kind of know when it's creeping up so that you don't get into that place where, either you're coping in those ways, or even honestly, like I've seen with my health, like the stress levels that I've had have then manifested in some other health problems that physically that my doctors are like, well, this is a sign of chronic stress. And when I look at where the chronic stress is coming from in my life, it's because of the undue pressure I put on myself. And so I think sometimes, especially when you're a perfectionist, you can be like, oh, like, it's fine. Like, I'm just going to push through. Like, it's not, this all just seems kind of vague. But when you really zoom out and look at like the really detrimental impacts it can have on yourself and others, it's like, you really do have to take care of these things. So, I'm grateful for like the work that you're doing and OCD and just even just the awareness around it, because I think, there's just like we've been saying from the start here, there's so much misinformation around it that you might not even realize like what it is that you're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah.
And so with that note, like how can working on self-worth mitigate our tendency towards perfectionism, and what are some of the practical strategies that you offer to your clients or anyone that might be struggling with perfectionism?
Yeah, so this is where I would fall back on what is known as CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, and ERP as well, and I kind of use them together. So if it helps, like cognitive behavioral therapy is kind of what it sounds like. It's someone understanding how their cognitions, their thought processes, and beliefs fuel their behaviors and their emotions. We've learned over time that those three things are always connected: thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So when we're talking about improving self-worth and kind of starting to what we'd say challenge or reframe perfectionistic expectations, we do usually start looking at someone's thought process, right? So that's where the self-criticism is usually occurring in our own heads, right? I always make the joke, but it's not really a joke, it's true. We all talk to ourselves. Everybody does it, and we're doing it almost all the time, whether or not we're fully aware of it. So often times the language we're using with ourselves in our own minds is really destructive, quite frankly. And so kind of like we're already alluding to, like when you're thinking negative things about yourself, it can be a good tip to sit back for a second and ask yourself, would you say the same thing to someone like you really love and care about?
Mhm.
Right. So, like using myself as an example, if I didn't get the grade I wanted, if I didn't do as well as I thought I should have on any project, whatever it may have been, if I came out of a social encounter and I didn't feel like I had put my best face forward for these other people, right?
Mhm.
I would come out of it telling myself a lot of things we've learned are cognitive distortions. These are unhealthy, unproductive thoughts that people have. So I was doing a lot of should statements. Should statements are, I should have done better. I
Mhm.
should not have said that. I was also doing a lot of what's known as labeling. I was labeling myself in really harsh terms. I'm an idiot. I'm a
Mhm.
loser. I'm a failure.
Mhm.
Questioning myself, what's wrong with me? Why can't I do better? Why
Mhm.
can't I be the exact kind of personality I want to be when I'm around other people so everybody likes me, right? All that kind of
Right.
stuff. So cognitive distortions are kind of these, everything is seen through like this really negative filter. And it's often just making negative assumptions about ourselves and how things should be or how they're
Mhm.
supposed to be. So what I kind of learned for myself and what I still coach people on is kind of using the CBT technique of identifying unhealthy, distorted thoughts that are causing upset, distress, depression, anxiety, whatever it may be, and are also fueling kind of unwanted behaviors, and
Mhm.
trying to find ways to reframe those. So literally coming up with another explanation.
Mhm.
So I could come out of a social interaction and my immediate reaction be like, I sounded like an idiot. They're going to think I'm a fool, right?
Mhm.
If I could step back for a second, I could also kind of reframe that and say, you know, my guess is nobody else was paying as much attention to what I just said as I was.
Right.
Maybe they're not thinking twice about me. Or maybe let's consider the positive possibility, because with cognitive distortion, it's all negative, right? So let's
Mhm.
consider a positive possibility. Maybe they liked me. When they laughed at that joke I said, like my immediate assumption was like, oh, they're just being nice.
Right.
What if they actually genuinely found it funny? What if they enjoyed it? Right.
Mhm.
So that's one thing to like take a good hard look at. Just think about the way you think about yourself in your own mind. How are you talking to yourself in your own mind? And if you're being really negative and harsh on yourself, like I said earlier, would you speak that way to someone else?
Right.
You tell someone you love or care about that they were an idiot or a loser or they
Yeah.
should be doing better, right?
Yeah.
And if the answer is no, I wouldn't talk to someone I care about that way, then it's not fair for you to talk to yourself that way.
Right.
So I think that self-talk is really important. And then I look at the behavioral piece, which comes along with ERP, which is this sounds counterintuitive, and most people don't like it at first. But for example, let's say you're afraid of making mistakes, go make a mistake, see what
Mhm.
happens, right? So I've encouraged people, with or without OCD, but with any kind of perfectionism, you know, can you send up an email? Can you write it up really quick? There's, some misspelled words in there. There's some really bad grammar. You've written the wrong name at the top of the email for whoever you're going to send it to, right? Make an email with a bunch of mistakes in it and send it and see what happens. There's usually some powerful learning that occurs, right? It's really uncomfortable, but the person does it.
Mhm.
They don't go back and correct it, right?
Mhm.
And then 9 times out of 10, they don't get like this horrible, terrible negative reaction that they were afraid of.
Right.
The person on the other end is not writing back and being like, what the heck is wrong with you? You had
Right.
so many
Right.
misspelled words. You call me by the wrong name. Like you're an idiot. You're a failure. Like, so when people actually start making mistakes and purposely getting things wrong, they usually learn that their feared outcomes never come true.
Yeah.
They can tolerate it. And over time, it kind of reduces that fear and kind of that belief that they have to get everything just right.
Totally. Well, it's funny because so I'm an actress, and a lot of times like I relate things like through that lens and kind of like, it's funny because with acting or really with any art, if you try to be perfect, like it actually takes away from the art and like the nuances of like what makes art and like what makes great acting is watching a human being living their lives, and human beings are not perfect. And so if you see someone that's like it's like a robotic performance, like there's
Huh?
perfectionism can be boring, right? And so I think like the thing that's funny is like when I care the least about an audition and I put so little pressure on myself, usually those are the ones I end up booking. And so there's like, that's kind of like my form of ERP is like when I can actually just like let go of it. And then honestly, that's when I do my best acting, and then like the results speak for itself. So it kind of is counterintuitive, but then those are the auditions I have the most fun with. And I think so much of perfectionism and OCD is around this sense of control. But if you try to control anything, you're gonna like suffocate it. And so I think being able to allow yourself to make mistakes and then even just like have fun with it and kind of harness that sense of like, well, like it's a lot easier said than done, but it's been fun for me in my journey to see when like I actually book a job when I like thought that I messed something up.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up. And I do appreciate you being so open about all your experiences, like on this
Yeah.
episode and all your podcasts. I think it's important for all of us to be open about, things that have caused interference in our lives and what we've learned from it.
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of thinking as you're explaining that, a lot of people with perfectionism have this idea that they have to be 100% prepared for
Mm-hmm.
everything at all times. This crosses the line with OCD as well, where people feel like they need to be prepared for any kind of situation, anything that might potentially go wrong. So,
Mm-hmm.
as you were sharing your experiences with audition, I was thinking back to one of the first presentations I ever gave in public with a
Mm-hmm.
colleague of mine years ago. And my colleague has OCD, and he's very open about
Mm-hmm.
living with it. And I had spent days, weeks, I don't even know how many hours, like reviewing exactly what I was going to say in the presentation over and over and over again, essentially trying to memorize it word for word
Mm-hmm.
as a script. And I kept asking him if he wanted to meet and practice and all this kind of stuff. And he kept saying, no, I'm good. I'm good. No. And we got there to the day of the presentation. And I asked him if he felt prepared. And he said, I didn't do anything.
Wow.
This is a guy living with OCD. And he told me later, like
Wow.
that was his ERP work, right?
Wow.
And he, like during the presentation, he was natural. He was off the cuff. He was cracking jokes. He was engaging. The audience loved it.
Wow.
And like you were kind of referring to, I was stiff as a board. I got up there and I was trying to remember my lines exactly, and people were tuning out. They
Mm-hmm.
couldn't care less. And then we got feedback after the presentation, and everybody loved the areas he had presented on and gave very, very low ratings on my piece of it. And this because I was caught up and I have to get this just right. I have to say it this very specific, perfect way for it to be good. But it had the opposite effect. It was actually bad.
Wow. Yeah. And I mean, well, thank you for sharing that example as well, because I think and we learn through all these experiences. There will be sometimes then when, like, to our point earlier of like procrastinating and not doing anything, and then you'll flop. So I think there is always that fine line between like, you know, not being prepared and then just like being easy on yourself. And I think with all of this, it really is just a practice, and like you never will be perfect in it. And that's kind of like it all kind of comes full circle. But I appreciate you sharing that as well. And kind of in like the heart of this podcast, and the reason why I do like to share these experiences, because I mean, maybe part of it is like my ERP work, so to speak. But I also think the more that we share our imperfections or the things that we're insecure about, there's someone out there that'll be listening and be like, I thought I was the only one that struggled with that. Because by the nature of this, like, it makes you feel ashamed and isolates you. And then it can kind of like exacerbate that cycle. And so I always like to ask people who are guests on this podcast, what is the imperfection that you're most proud of?
That is an awesome question. Yes.
Yeah.
Please keep asking that one.
Yeah.
That's a good one. Okay. The first thing that came into my head is I'm a father. I have three little boys at home. And I'm actually proud of the fact that I am by no means like the perfect dad.
Hmm.
I mess stuff up around them. I say stupid things. I get their friends' names wrong. The list goes on and on. I'm a human being. I have moments where I snap and I respond to them in an unnecessarily harsh way that I don't like. But being imperfect around them uh, has helped me actually teach them that they should just be themselves, truly. And I think also just kind of learning like I can get stuff wrong around them. I can behave a way I'm not particularly proud of around them. And it's actually a chance for me to own that in front of them, apologize for it, and our relationship gets stronger for it. Um, so so just kind of not getting stuff right day to day around my children so they can actually witness that. I'd say that's the general imperfection I'm most proud of.
That's amazing. And I think that there's so much to be learned by that because none of us are perfect. And so I think and to what we spoke about earlier of like where perfectionism comes from, it's from, it can come from anywhere. It can come from childhood. It can come from you watching a parent that had to be perfect themselves or made you feel like you had to be perfect. And so I feel like by them experiencing that and see how you deal with it actually helps them in the long term. So that's
Yeah,
really cool. And thank you for sharing that.
yeah, happy to.
And last question here. If you could leave listeners with one thing, I know we talked about a lot of different things today. What would that one thing be that you could leave people with?
Mess stuff up. Like truly, just mess stuff up. Don't try and get things just right or perfect. Because it's never going to last, even if you feel like somehow, some way you've achieved perfection for a short time. Just know that it will just be a short time and it'll pass. It won't be enough. So I would say just mess stuff up, purposely get
Yeah.
stuff wrong on a daily basis and see that it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great way to end too. I think like that's something I had a teacher when I was younger that always said like, "Is this going to matter in a few years? And if it's not, then like, what does it matter?" And so I think like having that mindset of like you mess it up and you see it actually doesn't really matter, and so it's a great place to end. And where can listeners connect with you? Find your workbook, find what you're doing through No CD.
Yeah, so no CD, definitely want people to check that out. Their website is treatmyocd.com. It's a great place to learn a lot about OCD. They have more information on the Treat My OCD website on all the different manifestations of OCD symptoms, including perfectionism, than any other site I've seen. So definitely check out treatmyocd.com for no CD. I have a Twitter account through my private practice. It is at Chicago CD. So it's Chicago CD. See what I did there?
Oh, I love that.
Because I'm in Chicago and my private
Uh-huh.
practice, the Chicago Counseling Center.
That's awesome.
And then the book is it's just called the Perfectionism Workbook. It's really easy to find on Amazon, and honestly, it's pretty cheap. So
Yeah.
I designed it. When I sat down and wrote it, I thought about how I would be working in a session with someone with perfectionism, and really just kind to try and write it like I was talking to you.
Mm.
I think that's what I've gotten the most positive feedback on. So it's the Perfectionism Workbook, pretty straightforward title, and that's on Amazon.
That's awesome. And I'll tag all of those things in the show notes. So anyone that's listening, just look there and you can find all the wonderful resources that Taylor has. So thank you so much for your time and for this conversation. I know that it really impacted me and helped me, and I know that it will help a lot of people. So thank you so much, Taylor.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been really, really enjoyable. So thanks.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for listening. I'll see you next time.